History Symposium. My name is Scott Esplin. I'm the Dean of Religious Education here at Brigham Young University, and I'm glad to welcome you to our symposium today. We're grateful for those here in the conference center who have helped make the logistical arrangements possible, and to the conference committee and organizers who have made this session and all of the sessions available today. You should have been able to grab a program on your way in. The programs are still up there if you missed them, and also these sessions will be streamed for those who are either unable to be in our presence with us today or may not be able to go to Salt Lake. They'll also be streamed from Salt Lake tomorrow. We're grateful to be gathered here to learn from gifted scholars and explore historical and global perspectives on Latter-day Saint history and religious liberty. I reflected last night as I was thinking about our gathering today on the remarkable contributions of this symposium. It originated in 2006, and across its 16 years of existence, has produced an astounding amount of scholarship. There are nearly 200 published essays that come from these symposia, spreading across the breadth and depth of scholarship on the history of the church. Volumes include key individuals like Oliver Cowdery, Joseph F. Smith, Wilford Woodruff, John Taylor, significant themes or events, including Joseph Smith's first vision, themes such as Joseph Smith's study of the ancient world, the growth and development of missionary work, the history of church organization and church administration, Latter-day Saint women's history, the intersection of business and religion, and the global reach of the church. All of these past volumes, as well as recorded presentations, can be freely accessed on our website, at the Religious Studies Center website, rsc.byu.edu. We invite you, if you're interested, to go back and look at some of the past symposia. As a historian myself, I reflect on the last time we gathered for this symposium. The event was one of the final public church and university activities before the global COVID-19 pandemic shut everything down. In fact, the very afternoon of this conference 2 years ago on Thursday, the university announced the immediate shift to online instruction. And then following Friday's events with President Oak's keynote address 2 years ago, the church announced the temporary suspension of all meetings. So we're grateful to be back together with you after 2 long and difficult years. Thank you for your attendance, in person or virtual. Thank you for being sensitive to people who may need to wear masks or others reasons as we try to keep everybody healthy and safe during a difficult time. We're also grateful to continue our partnership with the Church History Department of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We're thankful for their participation and their willingness to host the sessions tomorrow in Salt Lake. We invite you to join the sessions here on campus today and at Temple Square in Salt Lake City tomorrow. Thank you for celebrating the rich history of the church. We've asked Dr. Spencer Fluman, the director of the Maxwell Institute here on campus, to offer an opening prayer, after which Kate Holbrook from the Church History Department in Salt Lake will introduce our speaker, Professor Sarah Barringer Gordon. We're grateful, I think she goes by Sally. We're grateful to have Professor Gordon here, and we'll have Kate introduce her following Professor Fluman's prayer.
Our Holy Father, we pause at the beginning of this conference and this keynote session in humility and gratitude for the gift to be together. We're grateful for a season of peace here as we acknowledge a season of violence elsewhere and pause for thy blessing and spirit to be with the oppressed in Ukraine. We pray for a speedy end of this conflict and for those with influence to bring about its conclusion as rapidly as can be. We're grateful to celebrate today the life of the mind, and even as we seek to enfold it within the life of the spirit and soul, we give thanks for fellow travelers like Dr. Gordon, who's spent a lifetime of excellence helping us see our own tradition more clearly. I'm grateful for her effort to do her work so very well. We pray for thy spirit of peace to be over this meeting and all subsequent sessions. Give thee thanks for the space to be and the people to be with. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
Throughout her career, Sarah Barringer Gordon has been a leader in the study of religious liberty, teaching the rest of us how religious liberty developed over the course of American history. Her first book, The Mormon Question, Polygamy and Constitutional Conflict in 19th Century America, won 2 Best Book Awards, one from the Mormon History Association and the other from the Utah Historical Society. She has also written The Spirit of the Law, Religious Voices and the Constitution in Modern America, and she is currently drafting the final chapter of Freedom's Holy Light, Disestablishment in America, 1776 to 1876, which is about the historical relationships between religion, politics, and law. In addition to her other book project and the many articles she has written, she is co-editor of the series, Studies in Legal History. Professor Gordon teaches at the University of Pennsylvania, where she is Arlen M. Adams Professor of Constitutional Law and Professor of History. There she has received multiple teaching awards, which is a hint for you about what a good, generous person she is. Professor Gordon has received impressive awards regularly throughout her career. In just the past 2 years, these include recognition from the Princeton Institute for Advanced Studies and a research grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Also in recent years, Professor Gordon has been a Guggenheim Fellow, the McGuire Chair in Ethics and American History at the Library of Congress, and President of the American Society for Legal History. One result of all of this work is that news media frequently turn to her for comment on the constitutional law of religion and debates about religious freedom. In other words, we could not have dreamed up a more prepared, accomplished, wise, and engaging speaker to address us this morning on the topic, Making Room for Religion in Religious Liberty. Please join me in welcoming Professor Gordon to the lectern.
Like others here this morning, my gratitude, how am I doing? Am I doing all right? My gratitude for being able to travel here to see you is just unending. It's delightful to be here. I would like to thank my new friend, Kate Holbrook, old friends, Spencer Fluman, Kathy and Warren Daines, Debbie and Phil Barlow, and Nate Oman, among others I'm sure I'll see around today. It's just such a pleasure to be here and to think about religious liberty and reflect on the many ways that the past has built the law of religion we live with today. So let me start my lecture with a key point, which is that important aspects of American religious history have played out in courtrooms. And this audience knows how important the Latter-day Saints have been in that history. But here's the problem. Lawyers like me, and I think several other here, if you dare to raise your hands, there you go, thank you. We tend to occupy an outsized place in the story. Don't get me wrong, being a lawyer myself means that I value lawyers and thoughtful legal strategies. But I do think we can scare away those who are not trained in law. We tend to talk a lot, we lawyers, often in ways that are not necessarily polite. More pointed is the word I'd use. We think opportunistically, and everyone knows it can be difficult for the rest of the world to get a word in edgewise. Even so, I want to propose that law, just about ready. Okay, good. Thank you. Okay, even ahead. Law, cases, arguments, and reactions to legal change deserve more attention from scholars of religion. Think, just to give one important example, about the many and long-lasting effects of a case called Engel against Vitale, the 1962 Supreme Court case that held prayer in public schools violated the Constitution. That opinion produced more hate mail for the court than Brown against Board of Education, and has been key to the condemnation of secularism that has animated right-wing evangelical activism for decades. The law of religion has also been vitally important in the development of religious studies. The Supreme Court actually engineered the birth of the field, a story I'll return to later. For now, let me just say that without integrating law into the many disciplines embraced by religious studies, this is my takeaway point, our picture of religious liberty in America is flatter, narrower, and yes, less interesting than the reality. For the past 2 generations, lawyers have galloped away with the story, but we would all benefit from a more integrated picture. Talking across boundaries is something that Latter-day Saints do very well, and that I have experienced in my work with them. And I'm talking about a boundary I think we should cross. The constitutional law of religion has been unduly politicized from my perspective, because lawyers and judges who are willing to consult specialists in almost every other field assume that they are qualified to determine the parameters of religious liberty without considering what experts can tell them about religion. There's a lot at stake here. We take liberty very seriously. Scholars in law, politics, history, and philosophy probe the original understanding and evolution of concepts of freedom, rights, tyranny, conscience, dissents, federalism, due process, minority status, and more. But we rarely think deeply about religion. And after all, this conference is about religious liberty. I hope to persuade us, including we lawyers, that we should be just as serious about the study of religion as we are about liberty. We should recognize that liberty is only half the phrase. The religious half is too often assumed but not explored. This pattern goes way back. Bear with me as I outline what I think of as our long failure to connect the dots. The centrality of both religion and law to American life is virtually as old as the country itself. Almost 200 years ago, the Ur pundit Alexis de Tocqueville remarked on the power of law and lawyers in American society. Virtually every major question in American life, he said, even in the early 19th century, was translated into a lawsuit. Tocqueville also stressed how vital religion seemed to be to the young nation. And he spoke eloquently about the Great Awakening that was still underway when he visited the United States in the early 1830s. But Tocqueville did not connect the two phenomena. I want to propose that the confluence of these two enduring forces of American life has produced a rich legacy, but that it has also been costly. There is great diversity of religion in American society, and the great power of government affects the ways that believers inhabit secular as well as sacred spaces. When I first started thinking about how frequently law and religion have been so consistently present in American history, running the show even, I came up with a shorthand formula that seemed to me to capture two aspects of American culture: religious, litigious, religious, litigious, religious, litigious. And honestly, both words describe our country and our history, but the litigious part, it's kind of a steaming mess. Given the nature of the interests involved, it shouldn't be surprising that the law of religion has grown tangled and knotted, especially over the last 80 years. Since the middle of the 20th century, federal constitutional law has dominated the field. In the 1940s, the United States Supreme Court, known to us lawyers as just the court, incorporated the religion clauses of the Bill of Rights, that is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and applied them against the states for the first time. When they were drafted, the two clauses of the First Amendment that you see up there are addressed to the national government. They call out to Congress. But in a pair of cases in the 1940s, the court, see, I do it too, the court held that the Establishment and Free Exercise clauses had been transformed by the 14th Amendment. Now the clauses acted as a restraint on all American governments through the provision of a Second Amendment, the 14th, that was enacted shortly after the Civil War and prohibits all states from denying their residents due process of law. This assertion of federal power was part of a broader shift at the Supreme Court. At the time it was undertaken, it looked like the incorporation of the Religion Clause was one means of policing the boundaries of a new, much bigger and more powerful national and state government apparatus that was a byproduct of the Great Depression of the 1930s. But whatever we say about the incorporation of other aspects of the Bill of Rights, the Establishment and Free Exercise clauses have defied all attempts to achieve anything like an elegant or predictable law of religion. Instead, it's a constantly shifting and controversial area of law. This uncertainty encourages deeper controversy, showmanship, brazen manufacturing of cases by organizations dedicated to litigating such questions, and more. From this perspective, the past generations have seen a rapid deterioration. Now, special interest groups spend all their time looking for litigants to bring cases in which influential religious organizations have strong interests, including, say, for increased public funding, supply contracts with government, opposition to public display of religious symbols, school vouchers, and more. For the past 80 years, 80 years, the court has been embroiled in repeated attempts to delineate precisely what it means not to establish a religion or prohibit free exercise. We still do not have answers to those questions. Often, the clauses pull in opposite directions. Think of evolution, just to give one example. The teaching of evolution might offend the beliefs of some students and their parents, raising free exercise concerns. Yet a decision to teach creation science or its successor, intelligent design, would be to inject religion into a secular curriculum in violation of the Establishment Clause. We've never actually achieved a reliable standard for dealing with questions like this. That means that the law is, we would call it confused, inelegant, unreliable, whatever word. It's not orderly. It's not a system of rules that allow judges to achieve consistency, sustainability, or coherence. Often, judges dread Religion Clause cases. Litigants, too, are frustrated, but they are drawn to an area that seems so clearly designed to protect them, and yet even the smartest lawyers have trouble explaining the law to them or predicting what the outcome will be of a case. The deceptively simple language of the First Amendment has become a siren song. And I have to tell you, the tortured jurisprudence of church and state has fascinated and frustrated scholars like me and several other people in this room. Scholarship overflows law journals, and whole courses in law school are taught on the subject, but the subject still elides satisfactory resolution. Some scholars think coercion should be recentered as a central interest in religious liberty. Others tend to focus on funding, drawing a line in the sand on financial support. Some argue that separation of church and state was invented in the late 19th century and is not a core value behind the religion clauses, or that the Establishment Clause had never been incorporated and applied against the states. All of them have something to add, but to my mind, we focus too much on the government side of the equation. Many scholars are not attentive to religion, especially not religion outside their own traditions. There's a downside to this when thinking about religious liberty in broad terms, because it's always a bad idea to describe an elephant when you only see a small portion of it. Thinking more comparatively about religion makes everything richer. Some faiths, for example, including many Christians, affirmatively do not welcome religious diversity. They don't want to share the public square, they want to own it. Others have long sought a place outside the state. As Roger Williams put it in the 17th century, they cultivate, and here I'm quoting him, the hedge or wall of separation between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world, lest God make his garden a wilderness, as at this day. Only by standing away from and outside the hurly-burly of the profane world in this kind of separation would believers be free to serve as prophetic exemplars of God's will. Still others believe that religious diversity is welcome and that interfaith collaboration is the best medicine for peace and human flourishing. And then there are those that find all public talk of religion disturbing, who argue that religion should be entirely private and maybe not at all, that many believe that there is no God, and that public invocations or calls for blessing are not only ineffective, but harmful. But in an era of increasingly interdisciplinary scholarship and growing erudition among judges, it seems sensible that we might benefit from the kind of comparative viewpoint, a bridge for scholars of religion that could generate productive insights across disciplines. The same can be said from the other side of the coin, though. I'm not just going to hit on lawyers. Religion scholars have been woefully absent from the world of church and state. Maybe they're intimidated by the hard-hitting quality of conferences and scholarship in the area. There's a great story of a renowned scholar of the Second Amendment, that is the right to bear arms, who shifted his scholarly gaze to the First Amendment. But he found that church and state was so acrimonious, he couldn't wait to get back to the warm and fuzzy, well-armed militia crowd. Literally. Whatever the reason behind the dearth of scholarship from religious studies folk, the gap yawns. The small group of scholars called the American Law and Religion Roundtable only has law professors as members. The lawyers are themselves members of religious groups. Catholics dominate, but there are others. They are practitioners of religion, not students. Practicing lawyers, primarily those specializing in litigation, have rushed in. They see plenty of action. There are lots of cases, which in turn spark interest among the professoriate, and then lawyers get more ideas about how they might argue cases, and so on. The feedback loop between scholars and activists is considerable. And here I'm just Speaking of two people that might be familiar to this audience, Fred Geddix is a leader in the field, renowned for his amicus briefs. That just means friends of the court brief, one written in support of a side, but not on behalf of a client. Often, law professors advocate on behalf of a particular constitutional interpretation, explicitly or implicitly grounding their analysis on their own religious affiliation. They try, often with great skill, to build a case for their side, to win the reader over as they would persuade a judge or jury. This gives the debate liveliness, but it also can become vituperative, might be the best word. Church and state, whatever anyone might say about the field, is divided and divisive. As the law and legal scholarship focused inward on legal questions in the mid and late 20th century, the rest of the country witnessed an extraordinary revival of religion, a great awakening across the land and among many faiths. Most legal academics, even though they work in church and state, are not actually close observers of religious life. They haven't been especially sensitive to church polity or the rhythms of a liturgical calendar, other than the one they may practice as a member of a religious community. There's little attention to the law of religion outside the constitutional framework. I would point you, though, to the work of Nate Ullman, who's done some great stuff recently, just in the latest issue of the Journal of Mormon History. So he's an exception. But the private law, I want to stress, is as important to religious liberty as is constitutional law. And most of it is only known to practitioner. Religious studies scholars sometimes pay attention to what they call lived religion, but they steer clear of basic lived law, such as property contracts and even church polity. Today's scholars, the lawyers, really hope to be useful. They care about practicing believers, separation of church and state, and most of all, generating workable standards in law. They know the court has been attacked from all sides, and that the judges seem incapable of resolving swirling conflicts. I'm talking public education, medical treatment, government funding, military chaplaincies, employment law, prison life, schism, clergy abuse, public lands, marriage, the rights of parents, football games, I'll come back to that, and more. On the religious life, there's a group who are delighted with the new conservative Supreme Court, especially 3 Trump appointees. They've grown aggressive in ways that reflect the blood on the floor after years of contest and conflict. The 3 long-standing cases in the field look like they will be overruled. All of these cases, I should say, were the product of conservative judges who were appointed by Republican presidents. The latest case to signal maybe yet another reversal of precedent is, yes, God and football. God and football is a repeat player. Every football team seems to say the Lord's Prayer in the locker room and again outside, even at public schools, and even where Christians are not a majority of the student population. God and football travel hand in hand. And I have to say, such cases, like the one that's currently at the Supreme Court on football, come at the expense usually of the most vulnerable members of the equation. In this case, that would be students. The painful quality of such disputes aren't lost on many of us scholars, but the activists are relentless, and they really stoke the fire. We can't deny as well that there's been great change in religious life, which we should be talking about. It's been often quiet, but with increasing effects. There are many fast-growing numbers who have left behind whatever religious affiliation they may have had. A significant number of those describe themselves as spiritually active, but they do not want to join any formal denomination or church. I'm convinced that it's a mistake to say that religion itself is in decline, and I had a long fight with a BBC reporter about that. But the numbers show that there is something afoot, and religious groups are not flourishing in the ways they were just 20 years ago. The percentage of adults in the U.S. who are unaffiliated with any religious group has doubled in the last 15 years. The number of those who say they are Christian has declined precipitously. Something isn't going well, for sure, but more litigation doesn't seem like part of the answer. The bitterness and lack of a sense among lawyers of the great vulnerability of religious groups to all kinds of pressure makes it urgent that we explore what is happening and why. To pick up on just one sore spot, that school prayer issue, scholars disagree about whether the state itself could compose public prayers. Many say it's a bad idea, but many of those who oppose school prayer are fine with the inclusion of the words "under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance, which was introduced at the height of a pro-God movement against communism in the Cold War in 1954. So to be against school prayer but in favor of the pledge, it seems like parsing too much, things that just don't make common sense, that are counterintuitive. So a lot of the scholars just don't make sense to many people out there beyond the walls of constitutional law. There are also scholars who make really powerful arguments that we have overprotected religion. And many of those point to those declining numbers I was talking about, and I just want to turn to one of them now. Marcy Hamilton was a law professor and is now a full-time children's rights advocate. She argues that deference to religious institutions has corrupted government and exposed children to abuse and shielded those who should be punished. She says we have a romantic attitude and it has clouded our vision. She wants to persuade Americans to take off what she calls the rose-colored glasses and come to terms with the necessity of, and here I'm quoting her, making religious individuals and institutions accountable to the law so they do not harm others, right? And Hamilton's subjects range from sexual abuse of children to Muslim imams and gang leaders in American prisoners to, hold on to your hats, proponents of polygamy and opponents of same-sex marriage who are busy trying to manipulate the law, she says, to suit their religious conduct. Her solution would be to remove judges from the picture. She would have legislators take over and decide whether a given law should have exemptions built in for religious reasons. And she says even then, she would only support exemptions that have been debated in the harsh glare of public scrutiny. Now, I have to tell you, most scholars disagree with Hamilton. Her work is called problematic, and one even labeled it a poorly executed rant. Right? You can see why that Second Amendment guy felt like going back to the well-armed militia, right? But Hamilton taps into a long-standing mistrust of trained clerics and their supporting organizations that Thomas Jefferson shared and that has reappeared in multiple forms across American history, including among the Latter-day Saints, who have never supported a professionally trained clergy. That's one key element. Hamilton also reflects popular outrage at special treatment for those who claim their religion should elevate them above the law. Even more to the point, fear of religiously motivated carnage has rippled across American society, most recently in brazen acts of anti-Semitism, those synagogue shootings, and anti-Black violence. I'm thinking of South Carolina especially. And here I want to come back to something, a deep connection to anti-Mormonism. So here we have John Krakauer's book, which is subtitled, I don't know if you can see it, A Story of Violent Faith. He was picking up on that fear. He blamed the Mountain Meadows Massacre as well as 20th century murders of a young woman and her infant daughter on adherence to a particularly stringent form of Mormonism. And I am not endorsing this interpretation, but his work, the sales of this book, testify to the power of the fear of religion and its capacity to capture broad attention. Americans may be fascinated by religion, but they can also be terrified of it. Others agree, still others, agree that lawyers and judges haven't done a good job, and they disagree with Hamilton. They don't want to get legislatures involved. But this more powerful set of critiques is actually more devastating than Hamilton's. These critics trash the Constitution. There's a growing sense among many activists and scholars that a late 18th century understanding of religion and its relationship to government produced the religion clauses, and they have become all but meaningless more than 200 years later. Robert Kagan, long a Republican advisor, argues that the Constitution does not have the capacity to deal with 21st century problems, especially demagoguery. Others point to systemic problems and the fact that amending the Constitution has been seen as widely seen as impracticable for the past 50 years or so. That is, for more than 20% of our history, the Constitution has atrophied. One of the few religious scholars whose work actively discusses the law dismisses the religion clauses as hopelessly impractical. She argues that it is impossible to achieve disestablishment or free exercise, and claims that the attempt to do so have done more harm than good. Scholars like Jill Lepore at Harvard and many others, including well-known law professors, argue that the Constitution is well past its best-by date. But the traditionalists have not given up. Kent Greenewalt, a distinguished expert on church and state, has recently argued that a vital constitutional protection vital constitutional principle marks religion for special protection. This cri de coeur for the ongoing life and health of the Constitution also rests on nostalgia for past cases, a messy past, but one that Kent Greenewalt really admires. He especially admires a 60-year-old case called Sherbert against Werner, which held that a Seventh-day Adventist, a woman who lost her job because she refused to work on Saturday, was entitled to unemployment benefits. Sherbert was the first Supreme Court case to employ a compelling state interest standard for free exercise claims. This meant that only a compelling state interest could override Sherbert's right to practice her religion, even if the law at issue was neutral and applied to other people. But if Sherbert was correctly decided, which is what Greenewalt wanted to argue, then the 1990 decision by Justice Antonin Scalia in Employment Division against Smith. And I think we have a paper on Smith later, and I can't wait to hear it. That if Sherbert was right, then Scalia in Smith was wrong. In the Smith case, Scalia pulled back sharply on Sherbert, arguing that it had been like Pandora's box, which opened only to reveal chaos. To him, Sherbert was a disaster. Now, just to give you a sense of how volatile the law in this area really is, it looks like Scalia's decision in Smith is on the chopping block. I talked about those 3 cases, right? And Sherbert against Werner is back on the menu, boys, right? So paying attention once again to Sherbert makes sense. The author of Sherbert is on the left here, Justice William Brennan, who in 1963 was a powerful and persuasive justice. His mark on the law of church and state was profound, and not just in the ways we generally recognize. But 1963 is where I want to stay here, not just for Sherbert against Werner. But in that year, the court also decided a school called Abington School District against Schempp, which held that Bible reading and recitation of the Lord's Prayer at the start of the school day in public schools were religious exercises in violation of the Establishment Clause. That was only 1 year after the case we opened with, the Engel against Vitale, that prompted those impeach Earl Warren signs to go up for the first time. So when the justices faced a second case the next year on similar grounds, the length and breadth of their opinions testifies to their awareness that their prior decision had unleashed extraordinary opposition. But the decision to ban these very traditional forms of school prayer and scripture reading just 1 year after that earlier case shows that they didn't mean to qualify it, but that they doubled down. In the Schempp case, the majority opinion by Justice Tom Clark responded to the critique. He stressed that one's education is not complete without a study of comparative religion or the history of religion or its relationship to the advancement of civilization. The part I really want to focus on is Justice Brennan's 90-page concurrence. It ranged far and wide across the scholarship, case law, and constitutional history. Brennan wrote, and here I'm quoting him, "The holding of the court today plainly does not foreclose teaching about the Holy Scriptures or about the differences between religious sects in classes in literature or history. Indeed, whether or not the Bible is involved, it would be impossible to teach meaningfully many subjects in the social sciences or the humanities without some mention of religion." Now, Schempp changed a lot in unexpected quarters. Teaching about religion, thanks in significant part to Schempp, has become a staple of higher education. Early on, scholars of religion credited Schempp for the birth and subsequent flourishing of religious studies. As scholars interpreted and embodied the ruling, the Supreme Court instructed them that teaching about religion in public settings is constitutional, whereas the teaching of religion, that is the practice, is unconstitutional. Religious studies departments dedicated to teaching about religion at secular universities, including the U, sprang up across the country and gained greater currency where there already were religion departments in private universities. In 1964, the main professional scholarly organization in the field, changed its name from the National Association of Biblical Instructors to the American Academy of Religion. Multidisciplinary work, regrettably called polymethodic back then, and collections of scholars trained in anthropology, history, philosophy, sociology, and more populated the new religious studies. In a real sense, then, modern religious studies owes its existence to the Supreme Court. The field is now enormous and very dedicated to exploring lived religion, new religious movements, secularism, and more. In scholarship on the Latter-day Saints, Jan Ships was the first scholar in religious studies to apply the theoretical tools of the field in her first book, Mormonism, A New Religious Tradition. Her book changed scholarly work on the saints. For one thing, she took the Latter-day Saints seriously, bringing to bear fine analysis of prophecy, sacred text and time, Exodus, and more. She is one of the very few scholars in the field who, at the young age of 93, remembers how the mid-1960s were foundational to religious studies. When I talked about this lecture with her, she remembered that there was a massive new sense of possibility just as she began graduate school in the late 1960s. She trained widely, reading in theory, sociology, history, and more. The breadth of scholars in the field that was, in this sense, pioneered by Ships, and especially her work on the Mormon tradition, has allowed a new subfield to flourish. Mormon studies at Claremont, Utah State, Phil Barlow, Utah State, right? And now BYU. And the University of Virginia, and no doubt there are more underway or even announced, as well as the fine work of the Church History Department and scholars around the country have shown that religious studies was both a welcome innovation and a great benefit to higher education. This is a happy thought, and I'm winding up. I hope this thought will encourage scholars of religion to expand yet one more time and explore the work of law. Tracing the foundation of religious studies to its source in the constitutional law of religion reveals a lost history, one that illustrates the complex legacy of a decision that caused yet another round of calls for the impeachment of Earl Warren. Paying close attention to the relationship between law and the study of religion highlights the broader effects of judicial review in our understanding of the role of religion in American life and the flourishing of educational institutions. It seems appropriate to point out in conclusion that the flourishing of religious studies, while it may be indebted to the Supreme Court in the first instance, has not generally produced the kind of scholarship that in turn might be useful to the court. Justice Brennan was always a fan of expert testimony and scholarly insight used to resolve legal questions. He may well have hoped that encouraging comparative, literary, historical, and anthropological study of religion would provide sustenance for a court beset by criticism of its decisions in church and state. Just this past weekend, I had a long conversation with a lawyer I met and hung out with at a Mormon book study group. As we talked about a case that she's currently litigating in the Midwest, we struggled to think of scholars who might help the federal court understand whether yoga classes in public schools are religious and thus a violation of the Establishment Clause, or whether the connection to religion is so attenuated that it can't reasonably be lumped in the pile for purposes of constitutional law. We agreed to talk again in about a week, so please come tell me if you know of good people to talk to about this. But even at the end of our conversation, we agreed that we're not optimistic that we can find someone who would be useful. Decades of scholarship in religious studies has not yielded a workable definition of religion for constitutional purposes, nor has the broader public turned to scholars of religion for careful evaluation, say, of the role of prayer at high school football games, or the relationship of the Ten Commandments to the American legal order, and so on. And our Constitution needs help, right? The critiques are loud and growing, and if we could bring thoughtful work on religion into the way we deal with this controversial and benighted area of law, we might well benefit from it. So as I said, we need to learn to stop calling the lawyers lawyer down instead of lawyer up. We should make room for religion in religious liberty. Thank you very much.
We have about 9 minutes for questions. I have, for people who want to text in their questions, I have my computer open here. And then we also have somebody with a microphone who will grab those of you who raise your hand in the audience. The phone number is on the website. I'm just going to tell it to you. 385-799-5771. So if you send a text to 385-799-5771, we'll get your question. Do you want to call them?
I don't mind.
Professor Gordon, you have to use the microphone. Would you be willing to provide a prediction on whether Smith will be overruled this session?
I mean, that's such a great question. I think it's when, not whether. The result of Smith has been such a complicated and messy, different levels of protection at state and federal levels and so on, lots of legislation at the federal level. If Smith gets overruled, there was one concurrence in a case recently that said, Smith, we really need to think about what we will do before we overrule Smith. We have to have something to take its place. It has not been a successful or widely beloved case. Scalia himself was a deeply religious man, and he really didn't like the free exercise clause. It's a quandary in some senses. But yes, I think Smith has been controversial from the get-go, and we now have on the shadow docket, especially the orders of the Supreme Court where they're not engaging in writing full-fledged opinions. A number of the justices have said, oh yeah, we want that gone. And the question is how they want it gone. But it just shows you the turbulence. That's only a 32-year-old case. Great question, thanks. Oh, okay. Oh yeah, why don't we start back and then work down your name? Great.
You started with the Supreme Court, and if anybody that's paying attention can predict accurately the votes of 7 or 8 of these justices based on their political persuasion, is any of this relevant?
Oh, meaning is politics the answer?
Well, no, politics is the problem, right?
Well, yes, the court has been increasingly politicized, although I will say in the 1930s, there was a bestseller published about the Supreme Court called 9 Scorpions in a Bottle. So I think gives you a sense that it hasn't always been, sweetness and light in the halls of the Supreme Court. I think especially, I'm remembering as well the overruling of the Gobitis case, which held that Jehovah's Witness school children could be compelled to salute the flag in 1940. That case was overruled in 1943, pretty quickly. And in fact, the salute was like this, and people kept pointing out it's not too different, you know. I think once in that case as well, the justices dropped hints in speeches or concurrences saying, you know, I really regret voting that way, or my dissent feels smarter than ever. And so I think for them leaving tracks in the record is a good indication of what they're going to do. But it's not the case that all the justices agree on how precedent should be treated. I'm thinking especially of Chief Justice John Roberts, who is very concerned about volatility. So I think yes, it will be overruled. I think liberal justices have no love for Smith at this point, but they do raise a good point when it could be chaotic to overrule it without giving very clear signals about what should follow. Yeah. Thank you.
There are so many different religious persuasions with different ideas. So how is it possible to come with court decisions that balance all of these different beliefs with some degree of secularism? And I don't know how to do that. The Smith case, of course, was based on peyote, wasn't it, or something like that? Yes. That's a religious tradition. So how do we compromise rather than have one side or the other?
Right. In other words, sort of the winner-take-all vision that so many people have of court cases. I got to say that, you know, has anyone here ever been a litigant in a case? It's not fun. It's really not fun. So for example, the Old Order Amish won in Wisconsin against Yoder and deeply regretted having brought the case. I mean, it just shattered the community. So that's one of the things you raise, is that different religious groups, even if it goes their way, they pay a price, right? And just to get, you know, that the life of religion looks very flat on the pages of the Supreme Court reports. So one of the things that I think is most difficult is valuing diversity, but not allowing one set of people to get away with much more than others. And so really having a workable definition of religion would help a lot. Judges are very good at law, but they have not come up with a workable definition of religion. Also, accepting the great variety, as you so rightly point out, the flourishing of very different religious groups. In fact, that's part of what I yelled at the BBC reporter about. I said, you know, just because they're not wearing a coat and tie to go to the Episcopal Church on Sunday morning doesn't mean that people aren't engaging in religious activity. Like, you've really got to get over this affiliation thing, because it's so old-fashioned, right? So I do think that taking seriously the variety of religious life shouldn't mean that everybody gets everything they want, but it should mean that we work together to try to produce as much religious liberty as we can for as many people as we can. Is it? Oh, I'm getting, Kate's giving me she's going to pull out the hook. Thank you so much. I so enjoyed this.